power doesn't vanish. It shifts, it maneuvers, it lingers. In the dead of night, inside a high-rise office overlooking the Capitol, a seasoned political strategist leaned back in his chair, scrolling through the latest headlines. Stacey Abrams. Investigation expands. Billions in federal grants under scrutiny. Caroline Leavitt demands accountability. He smirked, exhaling slowly as he took a sip of whiskey. Predictable. Across the room, a younger aide looked up from his laptop. "You think this is just politics?" The strategist chuckled. "Politics? No, kid. This is about money and power and the people who believe they can bury one to protect the other. But $2 billion? That doesn't just go missing." The aide hesitated. The strategist finally looked at him. "Exactly." A beat of silence. Then, shaking his head, the strategist let out a quiet laugh. "But here's the real question. It's not whether the money was stolen. It's whether anyone cares enough to do something about it." The aide sat back, uneasy. "So, what happens next?" The strategist stood, straightening his tie as he moved toward the door. "What happens next?" He scoffed. "That depends on who controls the narrative." And then he was gone. Beyond the office windows, the city pulsed with quiet energy. Headlines were being drafted and testimonies were prepared. The battle had already begun. And by sunrise, 2 women would be at its center. One fighting to expose the truth, the other working to contain it. It wasn't just about right and wrong. It was about who would still be standing when it was over. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but Caroline Leavitt had no intention of stopping. Her office, dimly lit by the glow of her desk lamp, was a mess of reports, financial records, and legal memos. A fresh cup of coffee sat untouched beside her, steam curling into the air. Adjusting her reading glasses, she skimmed yet another document. This one stamped confidential in bold red letters. $2 billion. That was the number staring back at her, allocated right before Biden left office, supposedly earmarked for a climate coalition. She exhaled sharply. The door creaked open. A young aide, barely in his 20s, stepped in. His tie was loosened, sleeves rolled up, evidence of a long night. He held a tablet, his expression hesitant. "You're not going to like this, ma'am." Caroline looked up, brow furrowed. "What?" "I just got confirmation." He swallowed. "The money's already been transferred." She set the paper down. "To whom?" The aide shifted uncomfortably. "A group tied to Stacey Abrams." Silence. The air between them grew heavy. Caroline tapped her fingers against the desk. Then, with the crisp precision of someone handed a loaded weapon, she asked, "Can we get it back?" The aide hesitated. "That's what the Justice Department is working on now." Her expression darkened. "They're speaking with Citibank, trying to recover what they can," he added, rubbing his temple. "But let's just say they're not feeling hopeful." Caroline leaned back, exhaling through her nose. Typical. Absolutely typical. She picked up her coffee, took a sip, and then grimaced. It had gone cold, just like her patience. The press room inside the Georgia State Senate was packed. Journalists, photographers, and TV crews filled every available inch, all eyes on the podium where Caroline Leavitt was about to speak. The air crackled with anticipation. She stepped forward, gripping the microphone with the same precision she used to dismantle political opponents. Her gaze swept the room, sharp, unwavering. Then she spoke, measured, direct, cutting straight to the point. "I'm sure you've all heard by now. Stacey Abrams is under investigation." Silence. A charged pause. She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "This is the same investigative body that compelled Fani Willis to testify before the Georgia State Senate. And now, they're looking into Stacey Abrams." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fingers clacked against keyboards. Camera flashes ignited like tiny bursts of lightning. Caroline stepped forward again, her voice unwavering. edged with steel. And why is Abrams under investigation? Let's break it down. She glanced at her notes, more for effect than necessity. Because she's been funneling public dollars into her own network. She lifted an eyebrow, letting the implication hang in the air. Or, should I say, organizations associated with her have. The room erupted in a frenzy of questions and camera clicks. Caroline held her ground. This was only the beginning. I'm not saying it was her directly. Wouldn't want to be accused of jumping to conclusions. But let's look at the facts, shall we? She flipped to the next page in her folder, though she already knew the numbers by heart. One of these organizations had been hit with a massive fine. Another had received $2 billion in federal funds. The room erupted with another round of camera flashes. And now, the people of Georgia want answers. She met the gaze of every journalist in the AE room, and so do I. Meanwhile, across town, in a sleek, glass-walled office overlooking downtown Atlanta, Stacey Abrams sat at the head of a long conference table. Around her, a team of high-profile attorneys and political strategists shuffled through legal briefs, whispering among themselves. Stacey exhaled, tapping a pen against the polished surface of the table. "Tell me something useful," she said finally, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. One of her senior attorneys cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "They're going for optics, not evidence," he said. "And the numbers don't look great." Stacey leaned back, folding her arms. "Define not great." $2 billion in federal funding. A $300,000 fine against the new Georgia project. The media is already painting a picture. She let out a slow breath, nodding. She had spent years navigating the battlefield of politics. But this was shaping up to be a full-blown war. And she wasn't about to go down without a fight. Live on national television. Breaking news tonight. Former Georgia gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams is now officially under investigation by the state Senate. The broadcast cut to Doug Reen, a seasoned political reporter standing on the steps of the Georgia state capitol. The city skyline shimmered behind him, but the tension in his voice was sharper than the evening chill. Some lawmakers want to know how Abrams organizations handled billions in federal funds. Others are revisiting past campaign finance violations, including a record-breaking $300,000 fine levied against her voting group, the New Georgia Project. The screen split, revealing Congresswoman Caroline Leavitt sitting across from a news anchor in the studio. Her expression was cool and composed, the face of a woman who had prepared for this moment. Congresswoman Leavitt, critics say this: investigation is politically motivated, considering that Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who authorized it, may run against Abrams in 2026. How do you respond? Caroline didn't blink. Look, I don't care who's running in 2026. This isn't about politics. This is about the fact that $2 billion in taxpayer money was funneled into an organization tied to Abrams, and the people of Georgia deserve to know where it went. She leaned, slightly forward, emphasizing each word. When public money disappears, when ethical violations start piling up, we investigate. Simple as that. The anchor pressed on. But some say this is done and over with, that we should just move on. Caroline raised an eyebrow. No, that's not how accountability works. What do you say to Abrams' supporters who argue the Ethics Commission already ruled on this matter? Caroline Leavitt let out a small, dry chuckle. Oh, sure, I'd love to just take their word for it. But see, here's the thing. If we let politicians declare their investigations over, we'd be out of business really fast, wouldn't we? The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the sharpness in her gaze. Bottom line, the law is the law, and we're going to get to the truth, whether Abrams and her team like it or not. Meanwhile, at a late-night talk show across town, Stacey Abrams sat under the warm glow of studio lights. Her expression was composed, but her posture was just tense enough to betray the weight of the moment. The host, an outspoken progressive commentator, wasted no time. So, Stacey, let me guess, another politically motivated investigation? Stacey exhaled. nodding slightly before responding. That's precisely what this is. It's the same playbook we've seen before, a desperate attempt to distract from real issues by turning me into a political scapegoat. The audience murmured, approvingly. You mean like what happened with Fani Willis? The host asked. Stacey lifted her hands in a there you have it gesture. Exactly. They're using the same panel, the same tactics, trying to drag me in front of the Senate for a show trial just like they did with Fani. It's a circus, and the people of Georgia deserve better. She leaned forward slightly. And let's talk about this $2 billion claim, because the way they're spinning it, you'd think I walked into the U.S. Treasury and walked out with a bag of cash. Laughter rippled through the audience. Stacey shook her head, a tight smile on her lips. That's the part that's so ridiculous. These were federal infrastructure funds, legally allocated to climate initiatives. This wasn't some shady backroom deal. Her arms crossed now, frustration slipping through just enough to land her next point. But let's be honest, this was never about ethics or accountability. This is about power. It's about silencing voices that threaten the status quo. She turned to the camera, her voice steady, unwavering. They want a show? Fine. But I promise you this, I'm not playing the villain in their little production. The audience erupted in applause. The host smirked at the camera. Well, there you have it, folks. Buckle up. This one's going to be messy. The screen faded to black. The war of narratives had officially begun. A few miles away, the room was eerily quiet, except for the occasional sound of pages flipping and the distant hum of the city beyond the glass windows. Caroline Levitt leaned back in her chair, one hand tapping absent-mindedly against the desk as she read. The resolution in front of her was thick, legal jargon stacked on legal jargon, designed more to confuse than clarify. She exhaled sharply, flipping another page. There it was, a provision authorizing compulsory process. Caroline's lips curled into a small smirk. This meant they could force witnesses to testify. They could subpoena documents. They could drag Stacey Abrams into the room and put her under oath. She set the file down and looked across the table at her team, a mix of policy advisors and legal minds. One of them, a senior investigator, was already highlighting key sections. "We can get her in," he muttered, circling a passage in red ink. "This gives us the authority to subpoena her." Caroline raised an eyebrow. "So no more dodging, no more PR spin. We can make her answer under oath. What happened with that money?" The investigator nodded. "That's right, and more than that." He flipped to another section, his pen tapping against the paper. "This expands the scope of the investigation. We're not just looking at her campaign finance violations anymore. We're talking about how $2 billion in federal infrastructure funding was allocated." Caroline's expression hardened. $2 billion, and it was given to an organization linked to Abrams, Power Forward Communities. She pushed the file forward. "Tell me again, how fast were they supposed to distribute it?" 21 days. Caroline let out a low whistle. 21 days to move $2 billion. She shook her head. "That's not funding a climate project. That's a fire sale." The room went silent for a beat. Then another aide spoke, more hesitantly this time. "It gets worse." Caroline's gaze snapped toward him. "Oh, do tell." The aide pushed another document forward. The funds were distributed before the organization even completed basic budget training. He hesitated. More than 60 days before, to be exact. Caroline blinked. Once, twice. Then slowly, she sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "So let me get this straight. We handed over $2 billion, American taxpayer dollars, to a group that hadn't even finished a class on how to balance a budget." Silence. Then, Caroline let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "This is a joke, right? Please tell me this is a joke." The investigator across from her sighed, rubbing his temples. "No, Congresswoman, this is federal funding at work." Caroline Teal exhaled sharply. "All right, we've got everything we need to move forward." She closed the file with a sharp thud and stood. If she thinks she can avoid this, she's got another thing coming. Across town, in an upscale law firm's high-rise office, Stacey Abrams sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, staring down at the same set of documents Caroline had just been flipping through. Her lawyers spoke in hushed, tense voices, poring over the resolution like surgeons analyzing an X-ray before an operation. Finally, one of them, a seasoned litigator, cleared his throat. "They're going to subpoena you." Stacey didn't react at first. Then, after a beat, she leaned back and let out a slow breath. "That fast?" Another lawyer spoke up. Flipping through a legal pad, Stacey Abrams' legal team wasn't wasting time. "This resolution gives them broad authority," the head lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "They can make you testify." Stacey exhaled sharply, drumming her fingers on the table. "What's our play?" "Delay, stall, challenge the subpoena in court. We argue this is politically motivated. Paint Levitt as a grandstander using this to raise her profile." Stacey considered it, her jaw tightening. "And if we can't stop it? Then we fight it in that room." She tapped the armrest of her chair, lost in thought. Then, her eyes hardened. If they want to fight, they'll get one. Late evening, inside a private Senate office. The mood in the room was tense, the kind of tension that only came when a storm was brewing. Caroline Levitt sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, surrounded by senior aides and fellow legislators. Stacks of documents lay scattered across the surface, some marked classified, others bearing the heavy official stamp of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. She exhaled, tapping a pen against her notebook. "So let me get this straight. The same investigative body that went after Fani Willis for months is now turning its attention to Stacey Abrams?" An aide nodded. "That's right." Caroline's fingers drummed against the table. Fani Willis, now Stacey Abrams. It didn't take a genius to see the pattern forming. "Tell me something. Are we looking at two separate cases here? Or is this the same damn problem, just wearing a different face?" The room fell silent. Then, one of her senior policy advisors, a no-nonsense type with a permanent furrow in his brow, cleared his throat. "That depends. Do you consider $2 billion in hidden federal money a separate case?" Caroline's head snapped up. "What?" The advisor slid a fresh report across the table. "The EPA just uncovered $2 billion earmarked for a climate group linked to Abrams." Caroline's jaw tightened. "You're telling me Biden's administration stashed away $2 billion before leaving office, and that money just happened to find its way into a group connected to Stacey Abrams?" "That's precisely what I'm telling you." Her grip on the pen tightened. "And where the hell was the oversight?" "On this?" The aide gave a dry chuckle. "Oversight? You mean the part where the funds were supposed to go through multiple levels of scrutiny before being distributed?" He tapped the report. "Didn't happen." Caroline leaned back, rubbing her temples. $2 billion. This wasn't just about Georgia anymore. This was federal money, and that meant the implications were much, much bigger. She exhaled sharply, then turned to the youngest aide in the room. "Get me Zeldin." Across town. In a dimly lit office, Stacey Abrams sat with her phone pressed to her ear. She had stepped away from the war room, needing a moment to think. To strategize. The voice on the other end was calm and measured, a political ally, someone she had worked with before. "They're coming at you from every angle, Stacey. You need to decide. Are you going to fight this head-on, or do you have an exit plan?" Her grip on the phone tightened. "They want me to be the next Fani Willis," she muttered. "They want me dragged in front of the Senate, humiliated, turned into another political casualty." A pause. Then, the voice spoke again. "Then don't let them." Stacey closed her eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the alliances she had built, the movements she had championed, and if they thought she was going to roll over without a fight, they had no idea what was coming. Live on national television. Welcome back to Capitol Watch. Tonight, we have a special guest, EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin, here to discuss a rather staggering revelation regarding federal climate funding. The camera zoomed in on Lee Zeldin, sitting across from the anchor. His expression was unreadable. He adjusted his tie as the host wasted no time. "Sir, I didn't see any media coverage of this." Zeldin's eyes flickered for a split second. "I can't explain that." The anchor raised an eyebrow. "So let's get to the big question. Can you get any of that money back?" Zeldin exhaled, rubbing his fingers together before answering. "That's something currently being worked through between the Justice Department and Citibank." A silence settled in the studio. Then, the anchor leaned forward, voice dropping slightly. "With all due respect, Administrator, $2 billion taxpayer dollars went to a newly formed organization linked to Stacey Abrams, and from what we understand, this was just one of 8 groups that received funding from a massive $20 billion pot under the Inflation Reduction Act. How does that happen?" Zeldin's jaw tightened. "Look, I have a lot of problems with this entire scheme. Let's be clear. This wasn't just some standard grant allocation. We're talking about $2 billion in tax dollars, parked at an outside financial institution with virtually no oversight." The anchor blinked. "And as it relates to this $2 billion, Zeldin sighed, flipping open a report. "This particular organization received exactly $100 in 2023. The anchor's expression flickered in confusion. "100? Zeldin nodded. "That's right. Then in 2024, they received $2 billion. The silence was deafening. The anchor let out a low chuckle, not of amusement, but disbelief. "That's quite the upgrade." Zeldin pressed his lips into a thin line. "It gets worse. By all means, enlighten us." Zeldin flipped to another section of the report. Page 1 of the grant agreement states that this organization had 21 days to distribute the entire $2 billion. The anchor's eyes widened. 21 days? 21 days. Zeldin turned the page. And on page 7, it states that they had 90 days to complete a training course called How to Develop a Budget. The anchor's mouth parted slightly. Then he chuckled again, shaking his head. "So let me get this straight. The government handed them $2 billion, gave them 3 weeks to push it all out the door, and they didn't even know how to build a budget?" Zeldin nodded grimly. "That's what it says right here." The anchor shook his head. "That sounds less like a climate grant and more like..." He trailed off, letting the audience fill in the blanks. Zeldin finished his sentence. The TV screen flickered in Caroline Levitt's dimly lit office. She leaned forward, furiously jotting down notes as the interview unfolded. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head. They gave $2 billion to an NGO that couldn't even balance a checkbook. Across from her, an aide looked up from his own notes. And it was all set up in the final days of the Biden administration. Caroline exhaled sharply, tapping her pen against the desk. So either they were incompetent beyond belief, or this was deliberate. She didn't believe in coincidences. Taking another sip of her now cold coffee, she kept her eyes fixed on the screen as Zeldin continued speaking. "Oh, this is getting interesting," she murmured. And she was going to make sure the whole country knew it. The air inside the Justice Department conference room was thick with tension. Seated around the long mahogany table were top officials, Citibank executives, and federal investigators, all staring at the same grim reality printed across the documents in front of them. At the head of the table, a Citibank attorney adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke. "Look, I'll be blunt. This money isn't coming back easily." A murmur of frustration rippled through the room. Caroline Levitt, arms crossed, leaned forward. "Define not easily, counselor. Because $2 billion just vanished into a black hole, and I'm not in the mood for vague answers." The lawyer exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "What I mean, Congresswoman, is that the way this was structured, deliberately, I might add, makes it nearly impossible to freeze or retrieve the funds." Caroline tapped her fingers against the table, her patience thinning. "Explain." The lawyer pushed a set of documents forward. The Biden administration's EPA designed this in a way that actually gives more power to the NGO, not less. If we issue a notice of exclusive control to the bank, guess what happens? Caroline narrowed her eyes. I don't like guessing. Spell it out. The lawyer sighed. It activates a provision in the agreement that lets the NGO immediately redirect the funds. Not back to the Treasury, not to a secured government account, but to another external financial institution of their choosing. Caroline blinked. Then, she let out a sharp, humorless laugh. So you're telling me if we try to stop them from moving the money, it actually helps them move the money? The lawyer gave her a knowing look. That's exactly what I'm telling you. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then Caroline shook her head, exhaling through her nose. That's not just mismanagement. That's a damn escape hatch. One of the Justice Department officials cleared his throat. It was designed that way. Last-minute amendments were made to the financial agreements, just days before the administration changed over. Caroline let the weight of that settle. Then she spoke. So what can we do? The Citibank lawyer hesitated. We're still looking into it, but legally, unless we move before they initiate the transfer, our hands are tied. Then we move first. The room fell quiet. She glanced at the Justice Department officials. I want every financial record tied to this account on my desk. Every loophole, every clause, every backdoor they built into this. We need to find something before it's too late. The phone rang twice before it was answered. What's happening? Stacey asked without preamble, pacing her office. On the other end, one of her closest political allies spoke quickly. Levitt's team is pushing hard. They're trying to find a way to freeze the funds. Stacey inhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. And can they? A pause. Then the voice said carefully, Not if we move first. She exhaled, nodding to herself, then make the call. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. Caroline wasn't even close to calling it a night. Her desk was covered in legal documents, pages filled with the kind of bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo designed to bury the truth under layers of fine print. Across from her, one of her top investigators rubbed his eyes, tossing another file onto the pile. You're gonna love this one. Caroline looked up, unimpressed. That's sarcasm? Or do you actually have something? The investigator smirked. Oh, you're gonna love it. Remember how we thought they were just moving the money into some obscure account? Caroline nodded. Turns out they have a built-in mechanism to send it to an external bank the second we try to freeze it. Her fingers tightened around her pen. You're telling me they rigged the system so that if we try to stop the transaction, it just gets rerouted somewhere else? The investigator nodded, flipping another page. That's exactly what I'm telling you. They can just tell the bank, send my $2 billion here instead, and poof, money's gone. Caroline let out a slow, deep exhale. And let me guess, this wasn't in the original agreement? Nope, these little adjustments, all added. In just days before Inauguration Day. A heavy silence settled over the room. They had set this up on purpose. Caroline leaned back in her chair, pressing her fingertips against her temples. So not only did they dump $2 billion into an unqualified NGO, they also gave them an escape hatch. Her investigator nodded. And the best part? The EPA put all of this in writing. Caroline let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Of course they did. Why cover your tracks when you can just bury them under a mountain of paperwork? The investigator leaned forward, his voice lower now. Listen, Caroline, we need something concrete, a smoking gun. Right now, all we have is a mess of contracts and loopholes. But if we're going to go after them, we need proof that this wasn't just bad policy, it was intentional. Caroline exhaled, tapping her pen against the desk. Then we find it, whatever it takes. She reached for another file, flipping it open. They weren't going to let this go. Not now, not ever. Elsewhere, a quiet, upscale restaurant in Washington, D.C. Stacey Abrams sat across from a seasoned political strategist, a man who had survived more than a few political battles. He swirled his drink, watching her carefully. "You know they're going for blood, right?" Stacey nodded, unfazed. "Of course they are. That's what they do." "And what's your move?" Stacey exhaled, choosing her words carefully. "They want a spectacle, a trial by media. What they're not expecting is for me to control the narrative." The strategist raised an eyebrow. "So you fight back?" Stacey took a slow sip of her drink before answering. "No." She set the glass down, eyes steady. "I outmaneuver them." The strategist studied her. "How?" Stacey's lips curled into a slight smile. "I make it clear that if they come for me, they better be ready for what I send back." Silence hung between them before the strategist let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn, I almost feel bad for them." Stacey didn't smile. Outside the press conference, the air was thick with anticipation. Journalists crowded the steps leading to the entrance, microphones ready, cameras rolling. At the heart of it all stood Caroline Levitt behind a sleek podium, a stack of documents before her, a storm brewing in her expression. She adjusted the microphone. "Let's get right to it." The crowd fell silent instantly. The Stacey Abrams saga is far from over. Click, click, click. Cameras flashed like rapid gunfire. Caroline lifted a folder labeled Confidential, flipping it open with deliberate precision. The Georgia State Senate is investigating her. The EPA is investigating her. And now, new financial. Records confirm exactly what we suspected. This money didn't just slip through the cracks. It was designed to disappear. A murmur swept through the crowd. Caroline didn't let it take hold. She flipped to the next page. "Let's talk about these $2 billion, shall we?" She arched an eyebrow. $2 billion in taxpayer funds, meant for infrastructure, for climate, initiatives, redirected to a group connected to Abrams. And now, those funds are gone, moved, rerouted. And you know who else wants answers? The EPA. She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "They're going to the bank and saying, 'Hey, Citibank, you've got these $2 billion? Yeah, we're going to need that back.'" A few chuckles rippled through the press corps. Caroline didn't smile. "But it's not that simple, is it? Because the way this was structured, those funds weren't just sitting in an account waiting to be used. They were pre-programmed to vanish, funneled through a network of legal loopholes that conveniently activated just days before the Biden administration left office." She tapped the folder against the podium. This was not an accident. A beat of silence. Then, a reporter in the front row raised his hand. "Congresswoman Abrams has already called this a politically motivated attack. She says this is nothing more than an attempt to discredit her before the next election cycle. How do you respond?" Caroline's expression didn't waver. "If she wants to call this political, she can. But here's the difference between politics and facts. Politics is about perception. Facts don't care what you call them. This isn't a campaign attack. This is a federal paper trail." She dropped the folder onto the podium with a loud thud. And we're not done following it. On a polished news set, Stacey Abrams sat across from a seasoned anchor, her expression calm but measured. "This is absurd," she said, shaking her head. "A coordinated attack, plain and simple. The same people who went after Fani Willis are now coming for me." The anchor adjusted his papers. "But Congresswoman Levitt just presented documents alleging financial mismanagement. Are you saying these claims are fabricated?" "I'm saying this. If they had real evidence of wrongdoing, I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. I'd be in a courtroom." "So you maintain that all funding was allocated properly?" A small, calculated pause. Then, Stacey offered a tight-lipped smile. "I maintain that this is a desperate attempt to discredit me because they know I'm a political threat." The anchor studied her. "And what do you say to those who want the money back?" Stacey held his gaze. "I say, good luck." The room was packed, the kind of packed that only happens when something big is about to go down. Senate hearings were usually a slow procedural grind, but today was different. At the center of it all sat Stacey Abrams, flanked by her legal team. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Caroline Leavitt stood tall behind the microphone, flipping through classified financial reports as if she were presenting evidence in a courtroom. The cameras were rolling. The world was watching. A senator cleared his throat. "Miss Abrams, do you know where the money is?" Stacey didn't flinch. Every dollar allocated to these programs was done so in accordance with federal law. Caroline didn't wait for the senator's next question. She leaned forward, her voice cutting through the formalities. "Then why can't we track it?" A pause. Stacey exhaled, tilting her head slightly. "Because you're looking in the wrong places." A murmur spread through the room. The senator banged his gavel for order. Caroline smirked. "Oh, don't worry. We'll keep looking." A reporter in the back whispered to his colleague, "This is just the beginning." Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The investigation dragged on. Subpoenas were issued. Court battles loomed. The media fed on the spectacle, amplifying every accusation, every legal maneuver. But something deeper had shifted. This wasn't just about $2 billion anymore. It was about trust, transparency. The systems were meant to protect the people, but had instead been manipulated to serve those in power. It was about how money moves, how influence is bought, and how eventually the truth is often buried beneath legal jargon and political theater. Some saw Caroline Leavitt as a warrior for accountability. Others saw her as a relentless opportunist. Some saw Stacey Abrams as a victim of political persecution. Others saw her as the architect of a financial labyrinth designed to evade oversight. The truth wasn't just about what happened in that Senate chamber. It wasn't about who won the political battle. It was about who was paying attention. Because power, real power, isn't just about controlling money. It's about controlling the narrative. And as long as that remained true, this fight, it was far from over. At the end of the day, politics isn't just about policies, budgets, or ethics investigations. It's about who gets to ask the questions and who gets to answer them. It's about what the public chooses to remember and what they're willing to forget. And in a world where money moves faster than accountability, the real question isn't just where did the money go? It's who's next.